Welcome everyone, my name is Cody Scott, and in this video, we review the 50mm Canon 1.2. My friends, my family, and everyone else in between, welcome back to a channel that teaches you how to explore, inspire, and engage as an active videographer. My name is Cody Scott, and if you're new to this channel, feel free to consider hitting that subscribe button, like button, or dislike button if that's something that you're into. In this video, we're going to review the Canon 50mm 1.2. We're going to be talking about the characteristics of spherical distortion, chromatic aberration, optical distortion, bokeh, as well as sharpness. Now, I do have to mention before we talk about this even more that I'm not getting paid to say this, and I'm not sponsored by Canon to talk about this lens. Okay, now that that's out of the way. Before we talk about the characteristics of a lens, you first must understand the way light passes through a lens. When light passes through a lens, it hits all the glass elements, it then bends, and then funnels back down to hit the sensor. As that process happens, there are certain things going on with each part of that glass that we are going to talk about today. That makes up the characteristics of a lens. The first one being chromatic aberration. Now, I'm talking about this first because this lens is disgusting with chromatic aberration. What is chromatic aberration? When light passes through a lens, it hits all the different elements, bends, and then comes and hits the sensor. As it's going through the lens, it's emitting red, green, and blue light rays. As it gets to the end of the lens and hits the sensor, some of those channels are off. There might be more green, there might be more blue, there might be more red, but it's imbalanced. You can see this a lot in windows at a lower aperture or around the tree line as it hits the sky. You can also see it in the edge of the bokeh when you're shooting at a lower or higher, whatever you understand, aperture. Now, this lens is terrible for it, but we're gonna get there in a second. When you stop down to anything lower than a 2.8 with this lens, chromatic aberration is noticeable. It's even more noticeable when you're using a circular polarizer or an ND filter. If you wanna use this lens and avoid chromatic aberration, you're gonna have to shoot at a 5.6, maybe even a 5.2. With the Blackmagic, you can get into the sweet spot of a 3.5. With this lens, you can still see some of it, but not as much. It keeps the lens sharp, it keeps the bokeh looking good, and you can only see a little bit of chromatic aberration. On a scale from 0 to 5, 0 being no chromatic aberration, 5 being way too much of it, I'm going to give this a 5. Now, if I could give it a 5.5, then I would, but to be safe, I'm just gonna give it a 5 because it is noticeable when you're shooting at lower apertures like a 1.2, 1.4, 1.8, 2.0, and so on. But I don't shoot that low. I know you guys might do that to get some more low light. I shoot with the Blackmagic, so I have dual native ISO, so I don't ever have to do that. However, when you're in the situation, and I've noticed it, to shoot lower or higher apertures, whatever you understand, then you will notice chromatic aberration. Moving on to the next one. Sharpness. Now, this lens is stupid sharp. I love it. It looks good on people's faces and it retains its sharpness all the way from 1.2 and so on. It does look the best around a 5.6, like most lenses. I did test it and there are rumors that 4 does look good, and it does look good, but I like 5.6 to maintain that sharpness as well as some of that bokeh. But you know, I shoot commercial stuff, it works for me. If you like that dreamy look, then shoot at a lower aperture. Anyway, on a scale from 0 to 5, 0 being soft, 5 being sharp, I'm going to give this a 4. It could be a 4.5, but to play it safe, I'll give it a 4 because it does get a little soft once you start to stop down to like a 1.2, but then again, whoever shoots that low. Moving on to spherical distortion. Now, spherical distortion is when a light passes through lens, it bends and has to focus on hitting that sensor. When the light lands, it might land in front of the sensor, behind the sensor, or on the sensor. What you're used to looking at is a ghostly glow. When that light is focused in front of the sensor, you're gonna notice that the lens is still sharp, but it kind of looks like there's some atmospheric glow, like some kind of creative characteristic about it. That is spherical distortion. It can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing, that is up to you. On a scale from 0 to 5, 0 being none at all, 5 being a lot of it, I'm going to give this lens a 2 because I do notice spherical distortion with this lens. It is an older lens, and I think that when they were building this lens, they left out one of those components to compensate for this. So moving on to our next topic, which is optical distortion. Optical distortion is something that you see typically in wide-angle lenses or higher focal lengths like 100. it's either going to change the edges of the lens or the center of the lens. Because this 50mm lens right in the sweet spot, right between 100 and 24, then this is going to give you minimum optical distortion. Now, optical distortion bends the edges of the images, and you can see that as you move from left to right with a wide-angle lens, or right in the center of someone's face with a 100mm lens. Because this is perfect for someone's face and is the most pleasing to the eye and the most natural, then you get minimum optical distortion, which is why on a scale from 0 to 5, 0 being none at all, 5 being way too much, I'm going to give this a 0 because I do not spot any optical distortion with this lens. Moving on to bokeh. Now everyone knows that this is a bokeh champ. You can get to a 1.2 and you get that nice soft background with this, which is why it's going to rank pretty high once we start to talk about it. However, as I mentioned, there's way too much chromatic aberration happening when you do stop down that low, which offsets my score a little bit. I can't just ignore that there's way too much chromatic aberration coming out of this lens at a 1.2, 4, 6, 8, and so on. The bokeh does look good, but on a scale from 0 to 5, 0 being terrible, 5 being beautiful, I have to give this a 3, but it could rank higher because the bokeh does look good, but I just can't ignore the chromatic aberration. Now, one thing that I notice in this lens, apart from all of the other lenses that I have, is the focus breathing. I've used this on multiple sets where I needed a clean plate, and for some reason this lens just started to breathe by itself. And the focus breathing you typically see when you're switching focus points from close to far away. What it's actually doing is changing your frame. It's not changing focus, but it's changing your frame. So you might introduce more or less elements depending on where you're focusing. I also noticed that about this lens. It is a fair price, it will retain its value, and it's a pretty decent lens. Now, the last thing I have to mention is when you talk about buying an expensive lens, you're going to get more glass introduced into the lens to compensate for some of these inconsistencies. It's not that they're fixing the problem, removing it, it's that they're adding more glass to compensate for it. You can tell that there's some glass in here, but not too much. That is probably why it's a good lens, it's cheap, but they probably left the element out to correct for the chromatic aberration. If you guys wanted to pick this lens up, you can pick it up in the link below. That's all for me. If you guys found this video helpful and you'd like to learn more, hit that subscribe button, maybe the like button or dislike button, so I can continue to create content just like this for you. I'll see you guys in the next one.